If you could get a kiss from your favorite celebrity, how long would you want to wait before getting it? Why do things seem less meaningful or joyful over time than they were at the beginning? And what does this have to do with Netflix releasing all the episodes of a new show at once so you can binge? Or why companies always feel compelled to come out with new and improved products every year? Or why French revolutionaries wanted to make a week equal to 5 days instead of 7. Welcome to Inner Cosmos with me, David Eagleman. I'm a neuroscientist and an author at Stanford. And in these episodes, we sail deeply into our 3-pound universe to understand why and how our lives look the way they do. Today's episode is about why familiar things can sometimes lose their sparkle and what we can do about that. So let's start with the fact that when your brain sees something new and then sees it again and again, it becomes more efficient at processing it and it burns less energy on it. So imagine the first time you hear a really cool new song playing at the coffee shop. You've never heard this before, and your brain is screaming with activity, processing the tune and the rhythm and the lyrics. Why? This is because, in large part, your brain is a prediction machine. And this is a new song, and so it is unpredictable. You don't know where the lyrics are going or the tune and so on. So the song is cool and interesting and it holds your attention and you can't wait to hear it again. So you jump on your cell phone and figure out the name and you play the song from the beginning and you love it. Now you listen again. Okay, it's still good. Are you going to listen a 4th time? Maybe a 10th time? It's not clear you're getting the same enjoyment out of it at this point. So this is what economists refer to as diminishing returns. You're not getting as much out of it as you were at first. And in neuroscience, we can measure this directly in brain activity. And what we see is less and less activity in the brain each time the song plays. So the first time your brain is on fire with activity, and then the second time we measure slightly less. And as you listen to the same song again and again, you have lower and lower activity. This is called repetition suppression, which is to say that repeating something increasingly suppresses the brain's response. Why? Well, it's because we devote attention to things that are surprising. Because the brain's job is to make an internal model of the world, and the way that you optimize learning that model is by ignoring the stuff that you already know and just paying attention to surprises. So in the case of the song at the coffee shop, you're not enjoying it less because the music is any different, but because you're different. Your brain has become more and more efficient at recognizing and processing the song, and that frees up its cognitive resources for other tasks. Or just think about the first time you walked into your living room when you were first shopping for a place to live. The first time you entered, you were keenly attending to the layout and the colors of the paint and the lighting and the smell and the sounds. But now that you are an expert on your living room, you don't notice any of this. All your brain cares about consciously is novelty. In this case, is there anything out of place in your living room? Like, did the couch get shifted over? Or is there a stain on the ceiling? Or is there a candy wrapper on the floor? This is how the brain constantly optimizes its function, by paying attention to new things and not responding to the familiar. Now, this is at the heart of what drives brain plasticity, how your brain constantly is reconfiguring its circuitry. And in fact, in my book, Livewired, I proposed a new framework called infotropism, which is how the brain constantly seeks to extract the richest information from the world, which always comes from the new things, the things that it didn't already predict. So just like plants do phototropism, where they move towards the light, so brains grow their circuitry toward the highest new information. Now, that's what's happening under the hood. But what I want to explore today is the consequence of this, how that influences our daily lives, like the fact that familiar things like songs in living rooms and relationships and jobs and so on lose their color with time, and what we might do about that. So for that, I called up my colleague, Tali Sharot. She's a neuroscientist and professor of cognitive neuroscience at University College London and at MIT. And she's recently co-authored a book with Cass Sunstein, the author and legal scholar at Harvard. And this book is called Look Again, The Power of Noticing What Was Always There. So here is my interview with Tali. Tali, tell us, what is habituation?
So habituation is our tendency to respond less and less to things that are repeated or that are constant. So let's take a really easy example. You enter into a room, it's full of smoke. At first, the smell of smoke, maybe it's cigarette smoke, is quite overwhelming. But after 20 minutes, studies show you can't even detect the smell. You habituated to it. And just that you habituate to smells or even to a cold, you jump into a pool, it's really cold at the beginning. After a few minutes, you kind of get used to it. We also habituate to kind of more complex things in our life, both good and bad. And so we have less of an emotional reaction to them, right? So maybe it's a romance that was exciting at first and you habituated to it over time. Maybe it's a new house that is really brings you joy, but after a while, you kind of stop noticing it as much. As a consequence, those things that really should bring us more joy on a daily basis do so less because of habituation. And on the other side, you also habituate to the bad things. So there might be a lot of, bad things, even some terrible things around us. But if they're constant, if they're there all the time, we stop noticing them. Sexism, racism, cracks in our personal relationship, inefficiencies at the workplace. And if we stop noticing them, that means that we also less driven to change them.
Now, why do brains habituate? Is it critical for survival?
Yeah, so there's a few reasons. I mean, first of all, it's important to say that every animal habituates. It's not just humans, right? Every single animal. And I would say probably every neuron in our brain shows this habituation, right? They fire less and less when things are constant. When you see something that is, in a range of species, that suggests there's probably a good reason for it. There's probably an adaptive reason for this. So a simple one is it means that you can save resources, right? So if your neurons keep responding to things around you, but those things don't change, you're kind of like using resources that you should probably save for the next thing that is coming your way, right? So it's a way to save resources that makes sense. If something doesn't kill you, probably you can stop responding to it and you might need to, respond to something else that's coming your way. But on a higher level as well, it does motivate us. So if you imagine your first entry-level job, you were probably really excited about your first entry-level job. But if you were as excited about your entry-level job 10 years later, you wouldn't be motivated to go, and get that next thing, get that promotion, right? So it's a way to keep us motivated, and that's good, which means that it kind of drives us to progress, to try new things, to evolve. And then the third reason is that it is, on average, also good for our mental health, mostly because we tend to habituate to the bad things in life, which means we could bounce back. There are things that happen, perhaps a break of a romantic relationship, a loss of a job, or you just didn't get a project that you were wanting to get. If you just continue feeling bad about this and dwelling in it over and over and over, then you won't be able to just go, progress and move ahead. So in fact, we see that individuals who habituate slower to the negative things in their life, they tend to have more symptoms of depression. And in general, in fact, we see that problems in habituation, different problems of different kinds, are associated with a whole host of different mental health disorders and psychopathologies.
Got it. Okay, so that's habituation. We get used to things, our brains establish a model of the world, and once they have that model, then it doesn't have to use much energy to represent it. So what is this concept that you've introduced about dishabituation?
Right. So dishabituation means that you suddenly notice something that you've habituated to. So you're suddenly starting to respond to it again. And we have an example. It's a visual example, which I think kind of makes a point in the book. When you open it in the inside cover, it's blobs of different colors. So you have green, yellow, pink, blue, with a little fixation in the middle. And if you just fixate on this fixation in the middle and don't move your eyes for about 30 seconds or so, what will happen is that those colors will suddenly become gray. You won't be able to see the colors. And if you're really good at it, the gray eventually becomes white. That is habituation. And that happens because the same neurons are getting the same input of color, and so they stop responding. Now, the moment you move your eyes, then you experience dishabituation. The moment you move your eyes, you can see color again. So now your different neurons are getting different input, and now you can perceive the color again. So that's dishabituation, being able to feel and notice things that perhaps you had stopped noticing because they were there all the time and you habituated to them in the past.
So what are some real life examples of dishabituation?
So let's take kind of like a simple example. We habituate to our environment, right? I'm sitting in my office. I'm not noticing all the things around me because I'm used to them, right? I'm sitting here many hours, many days. But if I leave my office, or even let's say I leave my home for a certain amount of time, perhaps it's a weekend, perhaps it's a week away on business. When I come back, I will experience, at least for a short amount of time, dishabituation. So suddenly I will start noticing things again and I will appreciate the good. So maybe there's nice views out the windows that, now I can see green outside my window, but it's not really bringing me as much joy because I'm habituated to it. But if I'm kind of going away and then I'm coming back, now I start noticing things again, even the small things. It could also be family members. You take them for granted. They're there. But being away for a week, you come back and you're kind of like, you feel the joy again. There's a wonderful quote from Jodie Foster, which actually we saw after the book was already written. So it's not in the book. In the book, we have something else also interesting by Julia Roberts. But this quote from Jodie Foster, she talks about how she left her home in LA for, I think it's 6 months or so. She went on site to film. And then she says, what happens when she came back? So she says, I came back from somewhere that is amazing and beautiful, but you long for really dumb things that you've just used to, that 6 months ago, I'm sure I was bored by, but right now I'm like, my God, avocados are amazing, or I'm so glad I get to go to the gym again. So things that 6 months ago were sort of what I was trying to escape from, now everything is amazing, right? So what she's describing is dishabituation, right? She comes back and now she's dishabituated to avocados. She's dishabituated to working out in the gym. And now those things become, something that bring her joy. Of course, this is not going to last very long, probably just a few weeks, but that's dishabituation.
And so what does this have to do with companies putting out new and improved products every year, or car manufacturers, tweaking the model, even though the model was perfectly great last year? What does all this have to do with that?
Right. So we habituate to material things, right? So when you buy that new phone, you may be excited at first, or the new car or the TV. But if they're there all the time, you use them every day, the joy goes down over time, right? And then when, they come out with, new and exciting, that makes you want to get that new things, to get the kind of like joy, right? The little boost of joy from this new thing, which of course you will habituate to after a while again. So it does drive consumption. And in fact, it probably drives overconsumption.
Interestingly, in the book, you talk about dishabituation entrepreneurs as people who see things that have become normal to everyone else, and they try to make changes. And one example that I've always loved is during the French Revolution, there were people who said, look, now that we're building a new society here, let's change the week from 7 days where you work 5 days and have a weekend to a 5-day week where you work for 3 days and then you have 2 days off. And I remember that striking me when I was a high school student and learned about that, because I was so used to the idea of a week being 7 days and it had never struck me that you could do something different. So tell us about dishabituation entrepreneurs.
Right. So the idea is, it's an interesting example that you're mentioning. So the examples that we have in our book is mostly about how we kind of get used to discrimination in our society or inequality. And the idea is that if discrimination or inequality or other kind of not so great things in our society are around us all the time, we stop seeing them. In order to see them again, one thing is we could have someone to kind of like say, well, this is what's happening, which is hard to do, right? How do you do that? How do you make people notice these things that are just the norms, have been in society for such a long time? And maybe I'll just, before I tell you how one can do that, let me give you an example of why we will actually not be able to see discrimination and inequality if it's been around all the time. So the main reason is that our brain is a statistical machine. So we have experiences in our life, and based on these experiences, our brain makes assumption about what is a norm, right? What is to be expected. And if what you encounter is what you expected, there's no surprise signal in the brain. You don't notice it. So let's take a simple example. You walk into a plane and you look at the cockpit and the pilot is a man. And your experience is that in most cases, when you walk into a plane, you look in the cockpit, most times it is a man. And so your brain has made these predictions and the experience fits your prediction. So now there's no surprise signal, right? Nothing to think about. So we don't notice that. Not only does our brain make predictions based on the experiences that we've had, but it also makes assumptions about why we see these things, right? So maybe the assumption that you would make is that males are better at handling large equipment. And now those assumptions may actually influence your actions and decisions. So maybe it will influence who do you decide to hire, who do you decide to promote. And that is the problem that we're facing. What you want is a surprise signal, right? What you want is actually to go on a plane, and when you see that 90% of the pilots are men, you want actually to have a surprise signal to be, well, that's unusual. Why is that the case? So with dishabituation entrepreneurs, you want them to induce a surprise signal.
Okay, so let's get back to this issue about how we dishabituate in our lives and what we can do about it. So you quote the economist Tibor Satovsky, who says, pleasure results from incomplete and intermittent satisfaction of desires. So unpack that for us.
Yes. Okay. So the idea is that pleasure will reduce when we are encountering things, even if they're super great. If we're encountering again and again and again, the pleasure will be reduced, right? And what we want is we want to create breaks from those pleasurable things in order to experience the pleasure again. And let me give you first an example of just how pleasure goes down over time. So I was working with a big travel agency a few years ago, and they wanted to know what makes people happiest on vacations. So we went to resorts and we asked people questions to figure out what makes them happy and when are they the happiest. And what we found was that people were happiest 43 hours into a vacation. So 43 hours in, that's when like pleasure was peaking, right? And after that, the amount of pleasure went down and down and down and down over time. You know, day 8, they were still happy, but they weren't happy as they were at day 2, 43 hours in. Why is that? Well, 43 hours gives them some time to unpack, and start focusing on fun. But from that time on, pleasure just reduces because of habituation. So the things around them are less noticeable. So it brings less joy. And the other interesting finding here, that when we ask people, what was the most fun part of the vacation that brought you most joy, the word that they used more than any other word was the word first. They said, the first view of the ocean, the first cocktail I had, the first sandcastle that I built. Now, the second view of the ocean, that was still great. And the second cocktail, the fifth cocktail was still good, but not as good as the first. And that is because the firsts are the new experiences, right? So if you think about, okay, so how can I make a vacation more joyful? It suggests that one way to do it is perhaps to have more frequent vacations, but shorter ones. And of course, sometimes this is not possible. If you're flying to the other side of the world, that will be difficult. But perhaps you can have vacations that are closer to home, but just have more of them. So have more of those firsts, more of those 40 free hours in. Okay, so that's talking about vacations. But let's think about things that are simple, even more, simple than a vacation. So there's a really surprising experiment that looked into when and why does music bring us joy? So they had people listen to a song that they liked. And before they listened to the song, they said, hey, would you like to listen to the song from beginning to end, no interruptions? Or would you like to listen to the song with small interruptions? Every 20 seconds, I'll stop the song for 10 seconds. What would you prefer, David, if you had that?
Certainly seems like I'd want to listen to the continuous version.
Right. So 99% of the people said, no breaks for me, please, right? It is the most intuitive thing. Surprisingly, however, when they actually did the test, so they had one group listen it beginning to end, and the other group, they had breaks in between, what they found that, in fact, overall, people enjoyed the song more with breaks. And they were willing to pay double to hear the song in concert. So why is that? Well, if you're listening to the song from beginning to end, right, no interruption, you're really enjoying the beginning, and then perhaps you're enjoying it less over time because of habituation. Again, you're enjoying it throughout, but less. Versus, I break it after 20 seconds, and now when I start again, so you dishabituate. So now I'm starting again, the joy pops up again, right? And then you start habituating. I break it. There's a dishabituation, so joy goes up again, and so on and so forth. And they did that with other things like a massage. They asked, hey, do you want massage beginning to end, no interruptions? Or would you like interruptions in your massage? Everyone said, of course, I don't want interruptions in my massage. But again, when they did the experiment, people enjoyed a massage more when there were interruptions because, they habituated to the massage. There was a break. They started again. Joy pops up, and so on and so forth. So that suggests that we want to break things up. Right? Instead of binging on that Netflix show in one night, take it a little bit at a time.
So Netflix recently started a new model where they'll release an entire season all at once so that people can binge. But it sounds like your advice would be different.
Yes. And in fact, I've heard a lot of discussion about this. Not only do I think you will enjoy it more, right? If you have to one episode a week or whatever, you wait a week. Not only would you enjoy the experience at the time, what you're also gaining is a joy of anticipation. I told you about vacations and how 40 free hours in is the most joy. In fact, the most joy tends to be before you even left your house to go on vacation. So in fact, when they looked at people for a whole week before they went on vacation, they found that people were actually happiest the day before the vacation. So the day before they even were, going on the plane. And the reason was that the day before, they were excited, the anticipation of what was about to come, right? Because in their mind, the vacation was so wonderful. And when they went on vacation, it was good, but it wasn't quite good as it was in their mind the day before. So anticipation, there's wonderful studies showing that anticipation brings us joy, and often it brings us more joy than the actual experience. And that people are actually willing to pay to get this anticipation. So another wonderful study by George Lowenstein, he had a group of people come in and he said, pick a celebrity. So pick a celebrity, David, in your mind. And then he said, okay, and all the listeners, he said, okay, imagine getting a kiss from this celebrity. So I hope you chose a good one. And then he said, how much are you willing to pay to get a kiss from this celebrity? if the kiss was to be delivered immediately, in 1 hour, 1 day, 3 days, a year, 10 years, and so on. And he found that people were willing to pay the most to get a kiss from a celebrity, not if the kiss was to be delivered now, but if the kiss was to be delivered in 3 days. Because that gave people 3 days of like imagining it, where is going to happen, how is it going to happen, and that anticipation gave them joy. So back to our Netflix shows. Not only will you enjoy it more while you're seeing it because there's less habituation, but you will also gain the anticipation. There's also, specifically related to Netflix and shows, there's also this sense that some shows have this kind of cultural buzz around them, right? So you're making that longer as well, allowing people to experience things more at the same time and to discuss it. You go to work, talk about it. This is, I think, something that happens less today than it did when we were younger, when there was less of these, streaming. There was just a few channels with a few shows where a show was kind of a big thing. Everyone may have talked about it, but still, it still happens even today.
Am I remembering correctly that way back in the day, movies used to have intermissions? Halfway through, they would just stop and then you'd go out and get popcorn and whatever. Yeah, I wonder if that ended up being, gaining slightly higher ratings as a result of that. But what about watching a movie on TV that is broken up by commercials? That seems really annoying. We don't enjoy that more, do we?
So this is something that Daniel Gilbert told me, and I haven't actually seen the article itself, but the words of Daniel Gilbert, he says that there is a study that shows that overall people enjoy a show more with commercials. I have to go and find this.
That's
he
amazing.
said this is by Hal Hirschfeld, so we should be able to find it. But so that's apparently also a counterintuitive finding.
So tell us about ways that we can really implement this in our lives. In the book, you mentioned when you got COVID and you got exiled to the basement of your house, and you actually, enjoyed the new bedroom and the, seeing things from a different point of view. How can we inject this into our lives?
Right. Okay. So there's two things, and one is going back to this idea of breaks. So inducing breaks into your life. So yes, you can go away for a weekend or a week or so, but you're not always able to do that. And so perhaps you can take a break from your life while you're still, in your house. And so this is indeed a story that I tell in the book where I had COVID, so I had to go down to the basement so the rest of my family won't get it. And surprisingly, it was sort of an interesting experience. It wasn't that bad. It was a bit like going camping. And then I was there for maybe 3 days. When I came back out to the ground floor, to the world, everything seemed like it was resparkling, right? My life was resparkling because now I saw it. I was dishabituating, right? I went from the basement up to my regular home, and things just seemed a little bit better. So that's you might have a little vacation in your basement, but there's another way, which this one we actually heard Laurie Santos talk about. And she said, close your eyes and imagine your life without your family, without your home, without your job, right? Try to really imagine it with vividness and detail. And that really scares people, right? Obviously. And when you open your eyes, then again, that can cause some kind of resparkling and dishabituation just by using your imagination. And now the other way to induce more dishabituation, less habituation, is diversifying your life, right? Inducing more variety into it. And variety can take many forms. It could be maybe living in different places, but it could be more simple, like trying to interact with different type of people, if possible at work, working on different projects. Many companies have these rotations where employees can go actually work in different divisions, right? And that can cause dishabituation and induce variety. And in fact, when you ask people about what they actually want out of life, there are three things that people usually say. First of all, they say two things that they usually say and another third surprising one. So the first thing that they usually say is happiness, right? We all want to be happy. We want to feel joy. We don't want to be sad. The second thing that people say is meaning. They want the life to have purpose. That makes sense as well. However, things that bring you happiness and things that bring you purpose usually do so less over time because of habituation. So even if you're working in a very meaningful job, like let's say you're a cancer researcher, over time, it may feel less purposeful and less meaningful than it did at the very beginning. But then there's this third thing, which is overlooked and which really contributes to a psychological rich life, which is variety. If you're trying different things and doing different things, you are inducing dishabituation, which means that those things that make you happy are going to make you more happy. And those things that are make you have a feeling of purposeful and meaningful will do so more because of this variety. And what variety also does, it puts you in a state of learning. Because if you're changing your environment, you're changing the people you're talking to, you're changing what you're working on, you need to learn. You need to kind of figure out the hierarchy, perhaps in the new environment, how things work. And it turns out that learning induces joy even more than material goods. So there are quite a few studies on this. So a wonderful study by Rutledge and Blaine shows that when they had participants do a task and they gave them money for performing well, they were happy when they got money for performing well. But in fact, they were happiest when they learned something new about the task. So by having variety, and variety can be like, you can take a new course about, something that is outside of your field, learn a new skill. And that has been shown to induce joy because people like to see themselves progress. When you really feel down is when you feel that you are in a status quo. You can even be quite, let's say professionally, you can be really up high. But if you're not moving upwards, that can actually induce low mood and even to some extent depression.
This is very interesting because I always recommend people pursuing new challenges that are between the levels of frustrating but achievable. And I'm telling this from the point of view of cognitive fitness, of, making new roadways in the brain and keeping fit that way. But your point adds to that beautifully, which is it also brings joy. I just want to mention something that you said a moment ago about this idea of closing your eyes and imagining that things are gone. I received a fortune cookie many years ago that said, if you want to love something, imagine it is lost. And I thought that was so beautiful and powerful because it's exactly the same thing that you said, which is, okay, I'm going to induce variety in my life by taking all these things that I've totally habituated to, and I'm just going to imagine that they're gone. Either they died or I never met these people in my life or whatever the situation is. And then, yes, when you come back to reality, there's more appreciation there. Okay, so how do we implement this kind of knowledge in our lives, let's say with relationships?
Yeah, so in fact, we were listening to Esther Perel. What she recommends seems really consistent with this whole idea. So she says that when she asked people, she surveyed people and she asked them, when are you most attracted to your partner? The answers tended to be of two types. One was when I'm away from my partner and then I'm coming back, right? So this is exactly the break, right? So that's when they are very attracted to the partner. And the second one was when I see my partner in a new situation. Perhaps they're talking to strangers at a party. Perhaps they're on stage, which I've never seen them like that. So this is the idea of variety, right? And novelty. And she talks a lot about how novelty, and I don't know if she says that exact word, but that a little bit of distance and novelty can actually induce fire, and too much familiarity can actually reduce it. So on one hand, we want shared experiences, of course, but on the other hand, suddenly seeing your partner in a different light that you've never had before, according to her research, actually increases attraction. So in terms of how do we do that? How do we implement that in our relationships? I think two things. One is taking a break, and I don't mean like breaking up for a while. I mean like, a night away on your own, right? Just an evening or a weekend. And the second is shaking things up by trying different things, right? Instead of doing the same thing over and over, we have routines, and those are good too, right? To have your tradition, but trying things that are different.
Yeah, and what's interesting is across the animal kingdom, there's this exploitation, exploration trade-off, which just means animals spend about 80% of their time exploiting the things that they have learned, that they know, and 20% of their time exploring new things. And they have to do this because the world changes and you can't ever be certain that the knowledge you have is going to carry you distantly into the future. So they spend some percentage of their time trying out new things. And it sounds like this is exactly what we need to make sure we implement purposefully in our lives, because it's so easy to land in a routine and keep that up with our careers, with our relationships, everything. It's important to seek that variety. What other pieces of advice would you have along those lines for not only relationships, but our careers, our lives?
Yeah. So actually, let me just pick up what you were saying about exploration and exploitation. In fact, in the book, we talk a little bit about explorers and exploiters in the sense of relationships as well. Because, so you said, on average, perhaps 80% of the time we're exploiting, meaning we're doing the same thing over and over, and 20% we're exploring. But of course, there's a lot of individual differences. So there are people who are explorers. They want to try new things, whether it is travel to different places, try new restaurants, right? And then there are more people who are more exploiters. They like to do the thing that they know, go to the same restaurant, have a staycation, when you stay at home. And what this is not based on, real data, but what me and my co-author, Cass Sunstein, have noticed in our own lives and the people around us, we've noticed that within couples, there tend to be an explorer and exploiter, right? And that would make sense that would be a good union, because the real optimal point is probably somewhere in the middle. You don't want to just explore all the time, because then you won't be exploiting the good things. And you don't want to just exploit, because then you're kind of what's known as you're going to be stuck in the loco maxima, which means you think you're in a good place here, but there's all of these other good, better places around you. And if you are in that kind of relationship, you're pushing each other exactly perhaps toward the optimal point. So in Cass's situation, he thinks of himself as an exploiter and his wife as an explorer. In my relationship, it's the opposite, meaning I'm the explorer. My husband is more of an exploiter. And sometimes it could, especially I think at the beginning of a relationship, it might cause a little bit of friction. You want to do all these things and the other person just wants to do the same thing. But if it's a successful relationship, it pushes both people perhaps towards a better place.
Wonderful. And in terms of careers, what advice do you have for people?
Again, there are individual differences and there are preferences. And in fact, there is also individual differences in how fast you habituate. So there are people who habituate way faster than others. And that will lead to these preferences. Because I think if you're habituating faster, then perhaps you feel like you want more of an exploration. So if you are in a situation where you are not feeling like you're moving and learning and progressing, which tends to happen a lot in middle life. And we can talk about why that is in a second. So that is perhaps a time to push a little bit more into the exploration, right? Try new things. It could be simple things like take a new route to work, right? If you're always driving, try to bike. It could be simple things like that, or it could be like, let's try a different project. Let's try to gain a new skill. The impact of these things are huge. Oh, back to midlife. Yeah, what does it happen in midlife? So there's this really interesting phenomena, which is the U-shape of happiness, which is happiness tends to be relatively high in kids and teenagers, and then it goes down, 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 reaches rock bottom in your midlife on average, right? There's lots of variations on average. And then it actually starts going up again. And it continues going up on average until the last couple of years of life. But that midlife, that's really the down point for a good number of people. And again, there's variations. I'm sure you have listeners who are, no, midlife is my happiest time. But that's when you look at, thousands and thousands and thousands of individuals. And we think that there's many reasons for this, but one is that midlife is really the time where you have the most amount of sameness for most people. You've been in the same relationship for quite a while on average. You may have been in the same job quite a while on average. Perhaps you're at the top of your career, but you've been there for a while. And partially people, they have kids, and that also limits the amount of exploration that you could do. If you think about it, when you're younger, each day is new. I mean, you're learning something new every single day when you're growing up, when you're young. And even in your 20s, you need to figure out, who am I going to be with? You're exploring all the different options. You're studying, you're learning new things. And it's midlife when it's kind of the sameness. And counterintuitively, later in life is when you need to learn again, because the kids are leaving the house. Perhaps you're retiring. What are you going to do with your life? And it's really scary, but it jolts people into this new situation, new environment, and they need to figure it out. So it enhances learning. And often people will try new things. So if you're stuck in midlife, then you need to start thinking about, how can I induce variety? What can I change? And change is difficult because it requires effort. The easiest thing you can do is stick with the status quo. That's easy. You know how to do it. It is certain, right? If you make a change, that's uncertain. You don't know if it's going to be good or bad. You're going to put in the effort, and you don't know what you're going to get. If I do the same thing over and over, I know what I'm going to get. So at least I'm not anxious and uncertain about it. I might be unhappy about it, but it requires less effort. So change is it's hard. But there are studies showing that all else being equal, change does induce well-being and happiness. A great study by Stephen Levitt, he asked people, they went online and he asked them, is there something that you want to change? And it could be something small, like the color of my hair, or it could be something bigger, like exiting a relationship, starting a new job, learning a new skill. And they wrote down the change, and then he asked them to flip a virtual coin. And he said, if the coin lands on head, go ahead and make the change. If it lands on tails, stick with the status quo. And he got back to them 2 weeks later and 6 months later. The first thing he found is that those people who got heads, which means make a change, they were 25% more likely to make a change. So something simple as, a coin flipped induced people to go ahead and make the change. And the second most important thing he found, that on average, over these thousands and thousands of individuals, those that made the change were in fact happier in their life. And so I think there's two reasons why that is. One is, if you're thinking about a change, there's probably a reason to it, meaning you're probably considering it because something is not satisfactory or not optimal. And so a change is probably needed. It doesn't mean what kind of change, but a change is probably needed. And the second reason is, you're making a change. Inducing variety means dishabituation, means more learning, all things that tend to increase people's well-being.
Tell us about creativity and dishabituation.
As I mentioned, there's individual differences in how fast people habituate. And it turns out that people who habituate slower, on average, tend to be more creative. So there's a study that was conducted where it was shown that people who are creative, and specifically, these are people who either had wrote a book or have a patent under their name or had an exhibition of art, they tended to habituate slower. And the way that they measured it, they actually just had like a sound. So when you hear a sound over and over and over, your body responds to it less. And you can measure that by looking at, for example, skin conductance response. And so that is a finding. And the question is why? Why does slow habituation, why is that related to creativity? And perhaps one reason is that if you habituate slower to the things around you, you're perhaps processing them for a longer amount of time. So these random pieces of information, visuals, sounds, they stay in your mind for longer. And so these different pieces of information that usually don't come together are more likely to kind of collide, right? To collide in your brain, to create connections, because they are in your head in a sort of like soup, in a sort of mix. And we know that often the most creative ideas come from unconventional connections. So you can take a piece of information that's so super like mundane in one domain and another piece of information super mundane in another domain. You put them together and suddenly you have this creative solution. You see that a lot in technology, where people take rules from biology and they use them in the, to create some kind of technology. So these combinations, that's probably one of the reasons. And it could be quite confusing to have all these pieces of information in your mind, right? It can be something that can cause difficulty to focus and concentrate, but it also enhances creativity. And so how can we actually use that knowledge to be more creative ourselves? Well, there's a study showing that one way to do that is to induce dishabituation by going and changing your environment. So turns out that if you are sitting in your office and you are just, thinking about a problem, but then you go out and you take a little walk and then you come back, or vice versa. If you're thinking about a problem while you're walking and then you're coming back to the office, any kind of change, or even you're in the office and you're going to sit in a cafe or you're going to your kitchen, turns out that any change in your environment enhances creative ideas significantly so, although it only does that for about 6 minutes. So if you're changing your environment, then that will create dishabituation, and that will enhance creativity for about 6 minutes. After that, you're kind of like habituation again to your environment. So that is one way to enhance creativity, by just changing the environment and therefore making your brain more likely to be attentive to all these bits of information that are around you.
So that was my interview with Tali Sharot about her new book, co-authored with Cass Sunstein, called Look Again, which is all about how we habituate to things and how we can try to dishabituate. And I just want to add a couple of thoughts. So the first one is, perhaps because I'm in Silicon Valley, I see lots of startup companies doing their things, and I compare these to the big established companies. And the big companies have a difficult time innovating because they're too stuck in their methods and hypotheses and ways of doing things. And so what the clever big companies do is they give birth to spin-offs, and these spin-offs are young and nimble. And this, of course, is analogous to what humans do. Humans drop into the world full of vim and vigor and nimbleness, just like a young startup. But after a while, they accrue these giant rule books, these ways of doing things. Humans get stuck in their methods and hypotheses and ways of doing things. And so what they do is they spawn babies to go out and take on the next generation. Babies have these clean minds that are not already stuck in habit. The magic of children is that they are not as totally habituated as we are, so they can see things in a fresh light. Everything is new to them, and so they notice things that we have become blind to. And in this way, our daily endeavor to dishabituate is to become like a child again. And the second thing I want to mention is that I think good science is often about dishabituation. Not always, but many of the biggest moves in science happen from saying, okay, I grew up with this textbook and the textbook has all the answers, and yet I can't escape the feeling that there may be a different way to look at this whole thing. In other words, we've all gotten used to a particular story, but there may be a more powerful one available. So good scientists are always looking to shake off assumptions. In my postdoctoral fellowship, I got to spend a lot of time with Francis Crick, who was the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA. And what I learned from him is that he just assumed that about a quarter of the scientific literature he was reading was wrong, either because of mistakes or fraud or misinterpretation or whatever. He just assumed that when the community of scientists believe in something, it might be true, but it might not. And that was a very powerful lens through which to view the world, because it was essentially a constant lens of dishabituation, of allowing everything to be questioned, of encouraging everything to be questioned. That is what's needed to do good science. And presumably, that's what's needed to live a maximally enjoyable life, because one of the most important things the brain does is to seek novelty, finding new angles on things. This is what builds new roadways in your brain. So that sounds easy, but we always have to fight habituation, growing used to things. Habituation constantly makes us forget the colors of the world that we're in. But it just takes attention to reverse this. It's one of the simplest things you can do to better enjoy your daily life. And it's one of the most important things for brain health. And one of the things we learned today is that you can seek novelty, not by flying across the globe and jumping out of planes and fighting bulls, but simply by paying fresh attention to the things around you, simply by looking again. Go to eagleman.com/podcast for more information and to find further reading. Send me an email at podcast@eagleman.com with questions or discussion, and check out and subscribe to Inner Cosmos on YouTube for videos of each episode and to leave comments. Until next time, I'm David Eagleman, and this is Inner Cosmos.